Once you see it, you can't unsee it. If you did any one of these four things, it meant that you were still in the pagan temple. That I also believe that the new covenant is not time bound. It's like a cup that's being filled up with water. It's being filled, but it's not full yet. And I think that we're seeing what I describe as a second Reformation. Circumcision is nothing. Uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is keeping the commandments. Well, circumcision was a commandment. So what in the world is he talking about? This is going to get a little weird, but that's okay. So buckle up for just a second with me.
And if Mark came first and chose not to record the resurrection, but left the women afraid in an empty tomb, what have you done? You've just undercut the authority of Matthew, Luke, and John, who proclaim the resurrection.
It's that archaeology is validating what the scriptures are telling us.
The Bible only has one message. It's only one message. It's how the Lord is going to conquer death to give us life. That's it.
Welcome to Water into Wine. Today I'm joined by Caleb Hegg. Caleb is the Executive Director of TorahResource, an author and teacher and co-host of the Messiah Matters podcast. Today we're going to explore Abraham, the New Covenant, and the inclusion of the nations into the family of God. Welcome, Caleb Hegg. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I was wondering if we could start off, maybe you could introduce yourself and your faith journey.
Sure. My name is Caleb Hegg. I'm the director of operations for TorahResource. It's a messianic ministry based in Tacoma, Washington, but we're online. So my father started it in 2002. I came on board in 2006. I was not part of the actual, I wouldn't say that I was part of the actual ministry in 2006. I was pretty much carrying my father's briefcase and trying to maintain a media presence, which was difficult at the time. I fell away from the Lord. So I was raised in the Messianic movement. We came into the Messianic movement when I was about 5 or 6 years old. We attended a UMJC congregation for several years, and my father started to become unsettled about the position the UMJC had taken on Gentiles in the ecclesia, in the congregation. So we branched out, and for about a year we attended a Reformed synagogue in town. Now, at the same time, my father was pastoring a non-denominational Christian church. So we were going to synagogue on Saturdays, and he was pastoring. We were going to church on Sundays as well. Eventually, when I was maybe about 7 or 8 years old, my father started with several other people a Messianic synagogue in Tacoma, Washington called Beit Hillel, which is still around today. And so we went to synagogues on Saturday and the church on Sunday, and my dad was a pastor at that church all the way until I was 18. So 1999 is when he finally stepped away from the non-denominational Christian church and went full-time into the Messianic Jewish synagogue. So I was raised, I can't ever remember a time when we didn't go to synagogue. And so I was raised, I would consider myself second generation Messianic. That all kind of started, the reason my dad started looking into the Messianic synagogue was because when my great grandfather died, he kind of confessed before he passed away that he was Jewish and that we were Jewish. And it made a lot of sense. The writing was certainly on the wall. My great-grandfather was fluent in Yiddish and worked in a Jewish market, and so it made a lot of sense. But I don't think people in the family realized it until he finally confessed that we were Jewish before he passed away. So that was kind of how we got into it. My father had a double master's from Northwest Baptist Seminary, which is obviously a Baptist seminary. He did his MDiv thesis on the Abrahamic covenant and the Covenant of Grant. So he looked at Caesar and vassal treaties in the ancient Near East and compared them to land grant treaties in the ancient Near East, and then took the Abrahamic covenant and tried to see where that fell within ancient covenants. And so by the time he found out he was Jewish, and then by the time he started getting involved in the Messianic movement, he had already worked very much in the Hebrew language, in the Greek language as well, but focused on the Hebrew language, and had worked within ancient texts for quite some time and was very familiar with the covenant system. So it was an easy road into the Messianic faith. So he started writing. My father started writing papers in the late 80s. In fact, we still have papers from the late 80s up on TorahResource.com. And people were asking him, well, even before that, he became associated with First Fruits of Zion, which was another Messianic outreach.
Mm-hmm.
And he became their theological editor. So he was working with FFOZ, and he was writing, and he was recording audio and things like that on tape, believe it or not. And that's how far back it was. And people started asking for his articles. So anything that he was writing, people wanted to get a hold of. So he started his own website, Torah Resource. He started that in 2002, and it was really just a website where his material would be housed, and people could. Remember that this is kind of at the explosion of the internet, and so people hadn't really figured out exactly how people weren't just downloading PDFs. So
Right.
it was people wanted print copies of stuff, and so he started. You could request his papers and his books as he started to write books. You could request them on Torah Resource, and he would actually print them all out on his printer and then send them out. And so he started doing that in 2002. By the time 2004 came around, he was spending anywhere from 2 to 4 hours a day printing his stuff out and sending it out. And so he said, okay, it's time. I was looking for a job. I was not really walking with the Lord. I had started to fall away from the faith. And he said, I need a job. So he said, why don't you come and you can put all my papers together and send them out. And whatever money we make, you can keep. I wish I still had that deal, because it'd be a sweet deal today. But I did that, and like I said, I wasn't walking with the Lord at that time. The Lord started to bring me back to the faith in about 2009, 2010, right around there. I met my wife in 2003, but we didn't start dating until 2008. She was raised in a non-religious home. And so unlike a lot of people who come to the Torah movement and kind of have to almost reread the Bible with fresh eyes, she came into the faith totally fresh, and so that was different, I think, and it was definitely a blessing from the Lord. But she started asking me questions in about 2010. She started asking me questions about, could you die for my sins, or could anyone die for my sins? Why did it have to be Yeshua? Questions like, just questions like that. What is the Reformation? Questions that when you're not raised in the faith, things that you want to know, but when you are raised in a house that has faith, they're questions we almost take for granted. And I learned that as my wife was asking these questions. And my response was kind of like, well, what do you mean? Of course, Jesus has to die. Yeshua has to die for you. Well, why? It's like, well, that's what I've always been, as she's asking me these things, they were the most simplest of questions that I really couldn't answer. And it made me recognize that I really had no grounding in faith, and I really had just taken what was given to me and believed it. And so that took me on my own faith journey. And I came out on the other side right about 2011, 2012 is when my wife and I I rededicated my life to the Lord, and my wife dedicated her life to the Lord. I baptized my wife at that time, and basically from then on, we've been walking a very wonderful walk with the Lord. In 2017, I was still at the Messianic Synagogue. We felt like the Lord was telling us to do something else, so we left the synagogue. We were sent out by the leaders of our synagogue to start what we call a bridge church, which was the synagogue I was raised in was borderline like conservadox. It was borderline Orthodox, but mainly conservative. But it really did feel like a synagogue. It was not there. It didn't feel like a Christian church at all. And so we would see people who would come into the synagogue, and they were from the Christian church, and maybe they had questions about the Sabbath, or usually it was the Sabbath. It was I feel like the Lord wants me to start keeping the Sabbath. They'd come into the synagogue, and it was just complete culture shock. 45 minutes to an hour of liturgy. There's a Torah scroll being paraded around. I mean, if you've never seen these things, you just very maybe uncomfortable would be the right word for it. Just
Right.
culture shock is what I would think. So my wife and I saw that, and we said maybe there needs to be something else. If someone's looking for to start keeping Torah, maybe throwing them into a conservative Jewish synagogue that believes in Yeshua is not the first step. So we were sent out by our congregational leaders to start a bridge church. We looked essentially like a Baptist church, but we met on Shabbat, and we kept kosher diet, and we celebrated the festivals. That grew to about 40 people, and we were around until I think 2021 or 2022, right after COVID. So COVID had essentially, appeased itself, and we realized that people were starting to have to leave for various reasons. People moved to Texas to take care of their folks, or whatever it may be. People were just saying, the Lord's taking us somewhere else, and we said, okay, that's it. I think we're done here. So we've been all over the place since then. We've been back to the Christian church. We attend a Christian church on Sundays now. We still say prayers on Shabbat, and we're waiting to see where the Lord will take us next when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Okay, that's a fascinating journey. So growing up having synagogue on Shabbat and then church on Sunday, how's that form your view or your worldview at that as you're growing up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm very sympathetic to the mainstream Christian church. Seeing, once again, I was very young when my dad started to walk his journey into a Messianic faith. So it's always been for me synagogue and church, kind of. I know a lot of people, especially in the Hebrew Roots movement, are very harsh towards people in the Christian church. I tend to not be that way. I think that the Lord is doing a work in the mainstream Christian church today, and I think that we're seeing what I describe as a second Reformation. Luckily, it's not nearly as bloody or gruesome as the first Reformation. And so I'm happy that I see the prophecies. I believe that the prophecies tell us that the Gentiles will come to Torah and the Jews will come to Yeshua. And so for that to happen, the church can't be following Torah, right? And the Jews can't be following Yeshua, right? For the church to come to understand that they should be keeping the full Torah, they can't be keeping the Torah, or else they wouldn't be able to come to that understanding. And for the Jews to come to an understanding that Yeshua is the Messiah, they can't be following the Messiah. So I think that we're starting to see the fulfillment of those prophecies, and it's just the beginning, maybe child pains of those prophecies becoming true. I personally don't think that it'll actually happen in my lifetime. I think that we have a couple generations before we see the fullness of the prophecy and the return of the Messiah. I know that's a lot of people think that I'm just totally out to lunch on that. But, and by the way, if Yeshua comes today, I'm very happy for that. That's, I'm excited to see all the prophecies come true whenever Hashem wants to make them come true. But at the same time, I think we're a little ways off. But with that said, the I don't want to say revival, but maybe the Reformation that we're seeing, where all these people from the church are starting to say, "Hey, we should be keeping the Sabbath, or we should be keeping the kosher laws, or we should be keeping the festivals." And hey, the festivals point us directly to Yeshua and the work done on the cross. I think that this is just the very beginning, and I think that we're going to see more and more and more of it.
Okay. All right. So maybe we'll back up to so in the scriptures,
Yep.
the Abrahamic covenant. Do you see that as an important piece to this of understanding what that is, and do we in the body have a good grasp of that, do you feel?
I think that the mainstream Christian church and maybe even the Messianic movement has a little bit. Maybe they're just missing a couple of pieces of the puzzle, or maybe they just haven't fully recognized. I mean, clearly the church today has an understanding of covenants, and I think that there is a resurgence of this happening. Right, we see this even in the 90s with Bonson and others in the Presbyterian Church who are very big into covenant. Walter Kaiser Jr. wrote his book on the promised plan of salvation, which just is extremely focused on the promise of the seed coming and how this is that thread that ties all of the covenants together. There's a recent book called Covenant, which is all on covenants. Daniel Block has written extensively on covenants as well. So, I mean, we're seeing a kind of a return to this idea of covenant. And then, of course, even within larger scholarship, you have the new perspective on Paul and N.T. Wright, E.P. Sanders, Jimmy Dunn. All these guys are doing, and of course Sanders is with the Lord now, or maybe he's not. I don't know. I don't even know if Sanders was a believer or not. But the point is that these scholars have kind of brought us back to this idea of covenant. Now, I'm not saying that I agree wholly with the new perspective on Paul or anything like that. I'm just saying that all of these perspectives, and they're in different realms, right? They're in scholarly realms, they're in the Christian church, and they're in the Messianic movement. And we could talk about this in a second. The Messianic movement hasn't actually caught up, I don't think. But it's a renewed focus on covenant. And so I view the covenants as a wheel. So all the covenants form what I consider to be like the outer rim of a wheel. And you can't take any of them out. So the church historically has said, well, parts of the Mosaic covenant are no more, so they want to take that part out of the wheel. If you take something out of a wheel, it collapses, and I don't think that we can do that. I don't think we can take any one of the covenants out. And so all of the covenants, I think, work together harmoniously to form a picture of a wheel. And then the spokes all go into a hub, and that hub is Yeshua. So all of the covenants point to Yeshua. The Abrahamic covenant is interesting because it brings along portions of the covenant that relate to physical descendants of Jacob. The land is granted to Abraham's physical descendants. And so there is an aspect of the Abrahamic covenant. And I think that there is a difference between the Abrahamic covenant and the Abrahamic promise. We could talk about that.
Okay.
The Abrahamic covenant, though, is a land grant treaty. And so the land grant treaty is promising that if Israel keeps the covenant, they will get the land and they will be protected in the land. They will be in the land. Now, of course, the question of Gentiles comes into that, and I don't know if we want to touch on that now or later. But the Abrahamic promise, on the other hand, is the promise of the seed, which is prophesied first in Genesis 3:15, and then throughout all the scriptures, right? We see the seed continue to pop up.
Yeah.
And the Abrahamic promise is that in the seed, that is in Yeshua, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And we could talk also about what that means and how that is. But I think ultimately it means through salvation, right? So the nations are blessed through salvation in And when I say salvation, I actually mean inclusion into the covenant. And this is
Okay.
where I'm going to probably, I mentioned that I think that the Messianic movement hasn't really caught up.
Hmm.
I think that this is where the mainstream Messianic groups, like the big names, the MJAA, the UMJC, and the IAMCS, I think that these groups have a diminished view of Gentiles, even though they say that they don't. I think that they might not say it in creed, but I think that ultimately they treat Gentiles as second class citizens in the covenant. And I hold to one law theology. I think that as soon as a person comes to faith in Yeshua, they become a child of Abraham. They become part of the family. They are part of the covenant. And we could talk about all the implications of that, including the aspects of covenant in terms of land grant treaties to the physical descendants of Jacob. So I don't know which direction you want
Yeah.
to go, but there's a lot.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So maybe we'll just touch again. So yeah, you put a lot out there. So covenant covenant as opposed to not as opposed, but covenant and promise. So maybe you could go into that a little bit. And then yeah, definitely I think what'll happen is we'll probably interweave a few times coming back
Sure.
and forth throughout the conversation because you get this throughout history, you have this back and forth, and you have covenant, you have Gentiles coming in, and what does that mean? And the struggles that they struggle with in Acts, I feel that we get the same conversations now. So
Right.
I think that these themes will return. But maybe we'll go back to if you want to just go over the covenant and promise distinctions there that you made. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so the covenant itself is a land grant treaty, as I said. So the promise of the lands, right? That God, and we see land grant treaties throughout the ancient Near East. So it's not that Abraham's land, clearly anything from Hashem, anything from God is going to be unique and different than the surrounding culture. However, God uses the culture around at the time, so that Abraham is not completely out of water. He knows he's familiar with what God is doing at the time that he's doing it, and so he bases the land grant treaty off of other. It's looks very much like a lot of the other land grant treaties, and basically it's exactly what we would think. If you come and you do the things that I want you to do and you have allegiance to me and you serve me, then I will do all these things. What am I going to do? I'm going to protect you. I'm going to keep you in your land. Your enemies won't overthrow you. Your land will be filled with milk and honey, and which is just a sign of prosperity, right? You'll have food and all these things. However, if you don't, if you don't do as I say, and you turn against me, and you follow other masters instead of me, then I'm going to take you out of the land. You're not going to be in my lands, right? And we see this throughout, unfortunately, Israel's history is one of constantly following after other gods, right? And it seems like every time they figure it out, then quickly they turn back to the other gods. And so this is where it gets a little sticky. Paul talks about this in Romans. What benefit then is it to be a Jew? Well, much in every way. And I think ultimately what he says there, I'm going to paraphrase it, but ultimately what he says there is you've been given the covenants. And I think that means to maintain the covenants, and the Jews have done this, right? So when we look at the Jewish people, they have meticulous rules on how to pass down the scrolls and how to keep the Torah the way that it, word for word, line for line, jot and tittle for jot and tittle. It's passed down a very specific way. They've done this. The Jews, we've done very good at keeping the scrolls. And if we compare the scrolls today to the Dead Sea Scrolls of 200 BC, it's literally miraculous. Mathematically, it's miraculous. So, in that respect, the Jews have done that. They've also carried the prophecies of the Messiah, and the Messiah was prophesied through the lineage of Jacob, and that has come true. And so we see the fulfillment of these prophecies through the descendants of Jacob. And so even the non-believer, and I know that this is difficult for people, even the non-believer, the non-believing Jew has a role to play in this story, right? And so Paul talks about this, and he talks about, I think that Paul, his main arguments, his main topics is all about Gentiles. How are Gentiles included into the covenants? And we could talk a lot about this. I'm happy to go into this, but ultimately, and I think the entire book of Galatians is focused around this, and I think almost all of Romans is also focused around this as well.
Okay.
First Corinthians is another big one that is very heavy on the idea of Gentile inclusion. But ultimately, the Jewish people are given a temporal covenant, and that temporal covenant means that they have rights to the land of Israel. And they are the ones who are given this covenant, but they have transgressed. And so the other thing that we see within the Torah, within the prophets as well, is the fact that the Gentiles can attach themselves to Israel. And we call this enlargement theology. So a lot of people think that we believe in replacement theology. We don't. I do not think that Gentiles replace Israel. I don't think that a Gentile can become a Jew. I don't think that the Gentiles become Jewish, like bloodline Jewish or anything like that. But I do think that they become covenant members. I think Gentiles become covenant members, and they don't replace Israel, but they enlarge the believing remnant of Israel. And so this is why we call it enlargement theology. And we see this specifically in the prophets. We see in Zechariah the Gentiles come up to celebrate Sukkot. We see in Isaiah that the Gentiles keep a kosher diet. We see that they keep the Sabbath as well. And so these aren't Jewish laws. It's not a Jewish covenant. It's a relationship aspect, and this is what covenant is. It's relationship. So Paul deals with the idea of bloodline inclusion in Romans 9 through 11, and ultimately the conclusion he comes to is that to become part of the new covenant, you have to have faith in Yeshua. And I know that I'm going fast and I'm fire hosing here, but I do have to mention that I also believe that the new covenant is not time bound. So I believe that throughout history, in both directions of history, if a person had faith in Yeshua, whether it was faith in the coming seed that would deal with the sin problem, or whether it's looking back and saying it was Yeshua who is the seed and he has dealt with the sin problem, that faith brings us into the new covenant. So I believe Abraham was part of the new covenant. I believe that Moses was part of the new covenant. I believe King David was part of the new covenant. And now I believe that we are part of the new covenant. It's not fulfilled. It's not completely filled up, right? There is a time when all Israel will be saved, Romans 11. And this is the culmination, the fulfillment, the full realization of the new covenant. And so my father always used to say it's like a cup that's being filled up with water. It's being filled, but it's not full yet. And so there will come a time when the new covenant will be complete and full, and all Israel will be saved. And I think that includes Gentiles. In fact, in that passage, in the Romans 11 passage, he says a partial hardening has come upon the Jews so that the fullness of the Gentiles can come in. And the question I always ask is, can come into what? What are they coming into? And so this plays back into the idea of enlargement theology. They're coming into covenant, and therefore they're enlarging Israel. And his next statement is, and then, so the Gentiles will come in, and then all Israel will be saved. So I think that Paul is seeing all Israel as Jew and Gentile in covenant relationship with God, not just Jews. That's how I see that.
Okay. And so a couple of things there. In respect to the fullness of the Gentiles, I find, is there a relation, or it is intriguing at least, that in Genesis that Jacob, when he adopts Ephraim, says that he will become the fullness of the Gentiles, or something to that effect. And then Paul makes that statement you just claimed. Do you think there's a relation, or do you think that's more of a coincidence in terms in translation?
That's interesting. I've never thought of that, and I would have to go look at the Hebrew specifically and compared to the Greek Septuagint. However, you're on the right track for sure. And the reason I'd say that is because, first of all, Abraham was a Gentile. Abraham was not a Jew, and many within the Messianic movement want to say, well, essentially he was a Jew. No, he wasn't a Jew. He was a Gentile. This is why he's called the father of many nations. And Ishmael was certainly not Jewish, but Abraham was commanded by Hashem to circumcise himself and circumcise Ishmael and circumcise all the other Gentiles in his household. And so we have to remember that that Abraham is a Gentile. And in the first century, the idea of being, I mean, saved is probably the wrong word, but covenant inclusion, being part of the covenant, meant that you were a seed of Abraham. You were a child of Abraham, right? In, let's see here, what is it? It's Matthew 3:9. He says, this is John the Baptist, right? He says, and he's talking to the Pharisees. Okay, so the Pharisees come out to see what in the world John's doing and why he's doing it. And he's calling for repentance. And he says, do not presume to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children for Abraham. And then we have all these passages throughout the apostolic scriptures. When I say apostolic scriptures, I mean New Testament. So the apostolic scriptures, all of these passages of the idea of the seed of Abraham or the offspring of Abraham, right? So in the ESV, they say offspring. He says, I know that you are offspring of Abraham. This is John 8:37, Yeshua talking. I know that you are offspring of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me because my words find no place in you. So there, once again, he's saying you think that you have covenant inclusion because you're a seed of Abraham, right? And then, of course, what does Paul do with this? Well, Paul takes the idea of seed of Abraham or offspring of Abraham, and he applies it to the Gentiles. I think my favorite one is in Galatians 3. Galatians 3 is one of my favorite passages in the chapters in the entire Bible. But he says in 3:16, he says, now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. And then later in the chapter, let me get to it real quick. He says that the Gentiles are the seed of Abraham, heirs according to promise. So 3:29, he says, and if you are Messiahs, then you are Abraham's offspring, you're Abraham's seed, heirs according to promise. And so I think that this shows that the Gentiles have inclusion. And back to your previous statement, the other thing that I would point out is that Caleb, in the Torah, he actually in the Tanakh, he has two different lineages. The rabbis have a field day with this. They don't know exactly what to do with it. Some try to say, well, it might be two different people, but they admit, no, it's the same person. So why does he have two different lineages? It doesn't make any sense. Well, it says in the Torah that he's a Kenizzite. So he is not a Jew. He's not an offspring of Abraham. He's a Gentile. But then he gets a new lineage, and he gets the choicest land of Judah. How can a Gentile be given the choicest land of Judah? That doesn't make any sense. So the rabbis have a field day with it. Well, for me, it's obvious. He is essentially adopted into the tribe of Judah, and therefore he is given the lineage of the person that he resides with, the person that is seen as his adoptee. And we see the same thing in Ezekiel. In Ezekiel, it says that the Gentiles will get land rights in the last days. And in Isaiah 66, it says that some Gentiles will become Levites and will be priests. How is that possible, right? How can you become a Levite, and how can someone who's not a Levite become a priest? According to the Torah, that's totally not allowed. But Isaiah says that's going to happen. And so I see this as it's essentially location specific. In when the Messiah reigns from Jerusalem, if you reside in the land and you reside within a tribe, you will be adopted into that tribe. You will be seen as part of that tribe. If you live outside of the land, you will still be a covenant member if you are a covenant member. You'll still be considered a covenant member, but you'll be considered one of the nations because you're not living in the land. And this is how we see all the nations coming up to celebrate Sukkot. Egypt, if they don't come up to celebrate Sukkot, what's going to happen? There's going to be a plague. Why? Well, they're not living in Israel, so they're not considered one of the tribes. They're considered one of the nations, but they're still considered covenant members. And that's how I once again see this idea of enlargement theology.
Okay, that's helpful. Let's now, so you mentioned the new covenant in there a little bit, and your ideas around it. Maybe could you tease out a little bit more what your understanding of what the new covenant is?
Yeah. So, well, it's okay. Maybe to describe this, the easiest thing would be to talk about what the old covenant is.
Perfect.
A lot of people throw around the term old covenant. Especially within mainstream Christianity, we hear a lot, oh, the old covenant is done away with, or we're no longer under the old covenant, right? But the term old covenant is only ever used one time in the entirety of the apostolic scriptures. It's in Second Corinthians. And Paul uses it. So it's in Second Corinthians 3 through 5. He touches on this concept. And it's a pretty interesting concept that he talks about. But if you look at the way that he uses old covenant, and then you do essentially a word study using this word. I write on this in my First Corinthians Bible study, but he uses this same word old throughout his writings. And every time he uses it, it's talking about before a person came to the Messiah. So old flesh, old self, like anytime old is always like he's always talking about this word old that he associates with old law. He associates with not being in a relationship with Yeshua. And so if we take that same mindset and we apply it here, it fits beautifully. He says that whenever the Jews read the old covenant, that a veil lays over it and they cannot see Yeshua. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have Yeshua and if you don't have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, he talks about this in Romans 8. If you don't have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, then you can't see the Torah for what it is. You can't see Yeshua in the Torah. All you see is a law. And this is what he refers to as old covenant. Now, as soon as you come to faith in Yeshua, now you're indwelled with the Holy Spirit. The Torah is written on the heart. And now when we read the Torah, we see Yeshua in it. And this is new covenant. New covenant is a relationship with Yeshua. And this is why I say that the new covenant is not time bound. Yeshua says, Abraham longed to see my day, John 8, right? Abraham longed to see my day and he saw it and he was glad. So what does that mean? How did Abraham see his day? And I think that this goes back to the idea of Abraham believed God; it was reckoned to him as righteousness. What did he believe him about? He believed him about this offspring that was going to come. Ultimately, in the text, it's talking about Isaiah, right? But he's seeing this idea of the Abrahamic promise: "In your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed." He's seeing that through this idea of his soon-to-be offspring of Isaiah, and the idea that the covenant is going to be passed through that, and the promise of the coming Messiah is going to come through that offspring. And then, I mean, this is a totally different rabbit trail, but I think that actually the idea of circumcision there is a seal of this, and it's actually a pointing forward to the virgin birth. We could talk about that if you wanted to, but and I've written an article on that. But ultimately, he's given the sign of the virgin birth in his flesh, and he passes it down throughout his progeny. So.
Wow.
My point here is simply that I think that anyone who is a believer in Yeshua, who has faith in Yeshua, and I believe in salvation by faith or allegiance alone. I do not believe that keeping Torah is going to get you into the new covenant. I don't think that if I keep a kosher diet, all of a sudden I'm in the new covenant. I don't think that keeping the Sabbath is going to get me into the new covenant. The Jews do that, right? The non-believing Jews keep the Torah and they keep the letter of the law so perfectly, but it's empty. They don't have the main part, which is faith in Yeshua. And so faith is what gets us into the new covenant. And then from that relationship, the love flows from it, and love is always going to produce fruit. It's always going to produce those works. And James talks a lot about this. So does Yeshua. So does Paul. But we see this throughout the scriptures, that this relationship that we have with God is going to turn us into something different, and that difference is going to bring forth sanctification. So justification is first. That brings us into the new covenant. Once we're in the new covenant, we will have sanctification, which is an ongoing process that will happen all the way until we're glorified with Yeshua.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what comes to mind, and off the top of my head, I'm not going to be able to grab it, but there's places where Paul says something about oh, what the law says, and he'll quote something, but then what does faith say? He'll say something to that effect, and then he'll still quote like Deuteronomy or that it's
Right.
not in heaven. So it's interesting if you're looking at it as like a done away with or an old thing that's over, it's puzzling that then he's still quoting the Torah in his explanation of what the law of faith or however he puts that. I can't quite bring it to mind, but it to me he's discussing somewhat of the new covenant or that of the law of faith, and but he's still quoting, like you're saying how it's like activated through the Spirit through Messiah in you that you're engaging with it.
Yeah, and the law condemns, right? We know this, right? The law does condemn. So if we do certain things, and you could look at this on an individual level, right? If I do something that's wrong, there are consequences in the Torah, right? If a man commits adultery, what happens? He's stoned to death, right? So there are consequences for individual transgression. But on a national level, there's consequences as well, right? If we transgress as a people group, then we are exiled, right? And we're put under the thumb of our enemies. And so the law itself, whether on an individual level or on a national level, condemns. However, once we have faith and we come into that new covenant, now we are freed from the condemnation of the law. And this is how I take the idea of we're no longer under law, but under grace. If you look prior to these passages and also in Galatians 3, again, he talks about this. He references the condemnation of the law one time, and then he just says under law after that, right? He's talking about being under law. And so the idea is that sin or that the law will bring condemnation until we have faith. Once we have faith, we're no longer under the condemnation of the law, and now we are free to keep the law, and we're in the new covenant. So now it's no longer condemnation. Now it's this beautiful relationship that we have with Yeshua and we have with Hashem. We are able to be in this relationship now, and it's no longer condemning.
Okay. Okay, that helps. So maybe we'll turn again to so we have the death, burial, and resurrection of Messiah.
Yeah,
He inaugurates the new covenant. He says, "In His blood and His body is broken." He gives the Holy
absolutely.
Spirit,
Yep.
and that's spoken of in the prophets of the new covenant, Jeremiah and
Yep.
Ezekiel, that the Spirit will be poured out and write Torah on your hearts. Now, then we have in Acts, Peter and the disciples almost seem a little put off or surprised, shall we say, that the Gentiles receive the Spirit, which seems like the token of the new covenant without
Right.
being Jews, maybe we could say. And that kind of sparks a whole Jerusalem council and what is the place of the Gentile coming in. And I think in the church and in Messianic um, life today, you still have that conversation of what do you do with the Gentile? Um,
Right.
how much are they in? Are they, is it a distinction? Is it the
Yeah.
same? And do they, there's that tension, right? Is in the church, maybe it's like, is it replacing Israel? Is it, or is the Jewish distinction being erased? So there's a lot of tension there. So hopefully, I gave you enough there to maybe comment on your thoughts
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, and this debate rages even within one law circles on exactly what Paul is talking about and what's happening in the Acts, in Acts 15 in the Jerusalem Council. My father did a significant amount of work on this in his so my father was a prolific. My father's still alive. He's not working anymore, but so a lot of people when I say was, they think he's
Right.
passed on. He's not. He's still alive, but he's retired now. So my father was when he was writing. He was a prolific writer. He wrote over 40 books. He did a commentary on Galatians and a 2-volume commentary on Romans. He hashes this out quite a bit in his 2 commentaries there. And what he what he proposes is that Paul uses the term circumcision as a shorthand for proselyte conversion. And so the question, and this is one of the questions that we have within the writings of scholars who are trying to push the new perspective on Paul, like E.P. Sanders and N.T. Wright, how were the Gentiles viewed within the first century? This is the question that needs to be asked. And then also, at the same time, what did the Jews believe? Well, we already looked at the passage in Matthew where John the Baptist tells them not to think that just because Abraham was their father that they're in, right? God can make these rocks children of Abraham. And so, if we look at at not only the apostolic scriptures, but also some of the non-canonical literature, like Jubilees and whatnot, there's a real looking down the nose at Gentiles, right? Within Jubilees, if you're not circumcised on the 8th day, you're not a covenant member, and there's no way to become a covenant member. You're out. We see a little bit of this in the Qumran sect as well. They're not nearly as harsh as the Book of Jubilees, but there's almost this idea of like the Gentiles are just completely out. In Jubilees, you're not allowed to eat with a Jew is not allowed to eat with a Gentile, right? And then we see this same kind of thing happen in Galatians. So I don't think Jubilees should be in our Bible or anything like that, but it just gives us some context of the first century. And since we have the same thing corroborated in Galatians, we know that this is what's happening, right? The Jews are not wanting to. Peter separates from the Gentiles when the Jews come down because he doesn't want to be seen eating with the Gentiles. So obviously this is a problem. Okay. And so the first question we have to ask is, how did the Jews see themselves within the first century? And the scholars like E.P. Sanders, Jimmy Dunn, so on and so forth, they are going to tell you, well, it seems as though no one was really concerned about individual salvation in terms of how do I get into the covenant. The Jews believed that they were in the covenant already, right? They were born into the covenant, so they didn't need to get in their mind. And this is a correction that Yeshua and Paul kind of give to them, right? Like, no, that's not how you're in. But at the same time, then how did the Jews see? So if the Jews believed that they were in the covenant already through bloodline, what about the Gentiles? Well, it seems like outside of the book of Jubilees, it seems like there were ways for Gentiles to become covenant members. Now, there's a lot of debate among the scholars on whether or not people believe that they became Jews, like bloodline Jews, or whether or not they became like Israel or whatever it may be. But essentially, you could become a proselyte. And we don't know exactly what that looked like. We don't know what the process looked like. We don't know how long it was. We don't know what was involved in becoming a proselyte. We don't know if you went to the synagogue for a certain amount of time. We know what the conversion process looked like for a Jew to become in a scene at the Qumran sect, because we have the community law. And so we can see everything that they had to do. It was a 2-year-long process. And at the very end of it, what happened? Well, they were already circumcised because they were Jews, but they went through the waters of the mikveh. And so it seems like at the very least, what happens is they would go through some process. The Gentiles would go through some process. And I'm not talking about the Qumran sect anymore. I'm talking about Pharisees or Sadducees. They go through this process and then they get mikvahed. And at the very end, if you're a Gentile, what happens? You get circumcised. And this is like the end all of it, right? Once you're circumcised, you're seen as a covenant member. You're seen maybe as a Jew, but you're seen as a covenant member. And so Paul really hones in on this. And my father argues that the term circumcision, as Paul uses it most of the time, and we know that words have multiple meanings within the apostolic scriptures, but a lot of the time when circumcision is used, it can be used in multiple ways. It can mean the physical cutting away the foreskin of the male organ of procreation, or it can mean the proselyte ritual of conversion. And so Paul, my father has argued, and I think he's really got something here. He's argued that when Paul uses this, he's talking about a man-made ritual of conversion. So now let's take that idea and put it into the scriptures. Paul says 3 times throughout his writings, he says, circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing, but what matters is keeping the commandments. Well, circumcision was a commandment. So what in the world is he talking about? So if we rethink of it in terms of like proselyte conversion, we might think of it, and of course we don't want to change the scriptures in the wording there, but we might think of it like proselyte conversion is nothing. Not going through proselyte conversion is nothing. What matters is keeping the commandments. And then Paul really hits this home in Romans 4 when he talks about Abraham, because what he talks about is, was he circumcised first or did he come to faith first? Well, he came to faith first. And Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he became a covenant member. He's a covenant member. And then he was circumcised. And so he takes this concept and he applies it to the Gentiles. So basically what he's saying is, look, it doesn't matter if a person goes through proselyte conversion. If a Gentile has faith in Yeshua, he is a covenant member. He doesn't have to go through some man-made ritual. And so if we think of the apostolic scriptures now, and especially specifically Paul's writings, with this in mind, Galatians and Romans take on a very different tone, because what he's talking about is the fact that, hey, guess what? Gentiles are covenant members, and it's not through some ritual of conversion. They don't have to go through all these processes or anything like that. In fact, what do they have to do? Well, let's get together and have a council and we'll talk about it. Well, what they come to is the Gentiles, and I mean, this is the position I take on Acts 15. The Gentiles have to keep 4 laws. Why do they have to keep 4 laws? What's so big about these 4 laws? Well, if you did any one of these 4 things, it meant that you were still in the pagan temple. If you drank blood, if you participated in, cult prostitution, so on and so forth, right? If you look at all 4 of these laws, they have to do with what the pagans were doing. If you are a Gentile who comes into the synagogue and you're still doing these things, then you're not a covenant member. You are still a pagan. And then what does he say in Acts 15:21? He says, "For Moses is preached every Shabbat in the synagogue." Well, why does he say that? He says that because he expects that if the Gentiles keep these 4 laws, they will be accepted into the synagogue, and they will be able to learn the rest of the Torah of Moses, and they will be able to now integrate themselves into the covenant people of God. They don't have to go through this man-made ritual during this man-made proselyte ritual, and once again, it probably took maybe a year or something like that to get through this. Were they considered covenant members? No, they were not. And Paul is totally against this. No, Abraham believed God and then he was circumcised. It's not the other way around. So this is how we see this idea of circumcision in the first century, especially when it comes to Paul, and the idea of covenant inclusion for the Gentiles.
Okay. Yeah, that's really good information too. And yeah, it's hard when we are so removed from the context to read it, and it's hard to know what the idioms are that we're reading, and right. Taking, of course you do take it literal, but then there is, depending on the genre, the context, like there's different ways, the translation of what's being spoken, and trying to really understand what's being said, right?
Right.
So, a thing that I've noticed recently too, like we were just talking about Acts 15, and it appears that James seems to be presiding over this movement of the apostles. I don't know if you'd call him the head, but he seems to be in charge.
Yeah.
And then when we look at the book of James, if this is the head of the messianic movement,
right,
that might be more weight that we maybe give it, that book of James. And he says he's addressing basically all Israel, I believe, right? So that occurred to me actually not too long ago, that, wow, this was the head of the movement, and this is the book that he wrote instructing believers. So I just thought that was a interesting and fascinating.
You don't get away from it's interesting because obviously with the work I do, I talk to a lot of people, and on all different walks. You have people who have been in the Messianic movement longer than I've been alive. You have people who are brand new, and we actually have some friends that just came to Torah within the past year, and so they come over to our house all the time. They're not Jewish. They're not, they weren't raised in a Jewish home. In fact, they were raised in liberal Christian theology, and so this is all brand new to them, and it's really interesting to see those light bulbs go on once a person sees it. And actually, we were with our friends last night, and he said to me, "I just don't understand. Once you see it, you can't unsee it." And he's right. Once you start to see the favorable view of the Torah within the scriptures, and not just within the apostolic scriptures, but throughout all scripture, like the Torah is this pinnacle thing. It's this wonderful, blessed thing. And I argue that the Torah is, so this is going to get a little weird, but that's okay. So buckle up for just a second with me. I think that in Proverbs 8 and 9, when the writer is talking about God forming wisdom at the foundations of the world, and the reformers had a problem with this because initially they said, "Oh, it's Yeshua." But then Arius came along and said, well, that means Yeshua is created, because it says that wisdom was created at the foundation of the world. And of course, God's wisdom is eternal, right? It's not created. But what's he talking about in Proverbs? And of course, once again, Proverbs is not, we're not building halakha, we're not building law off of Proverbs, but something is going on in that text. So I've argued that I think that God actually creates the Torah, the written word, the 5 books of Moses. He writes at the foundation of the world. And why would he do that? Well, Yeshua is the perfect representation of God. He is God incarnate. He's God in the flesh. And I think that the Torah, John 1, right? The Word became flesh. So in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I think that the Torah is the perfect picture of Yeshua. If we want to know what Yeshua did, we can go read the apostolic scriptures now. But if we want to know what Yeshua thinks, or if we want to know what Yeshua, how he would deal with a situation or something like that, we read the Torah. It is it's a perfect picture. It's like if a husband gives, or a wife gives her a newlywed husband a picture, right? It used to be, before we had phones, that we would keep pictures in our wallets, right? And we could look at the picture of our bride. Now it's the back screen of our smartphone, right? You turn on the smartphone and you have the picture of your wife and kids or whatever behind your apps. And so the point is that it's like when we become a covenant member, God gives us this picture of our groom, and that picture is Yeshua, and it is the Torah. He gives our birthright, Jew or Gentile. When you come to faith in Yeshua, you are given the birthright, which is the Torah. It's the covenant. Oh, that's how I've always thought about it. So, okay. Sorry, that is a rabbit trail of rabbit trails for you.
That's fascinating. And maybe just going off of that, the Torah, maybe you could speak to the Torah portions or the cycles, or where does that come from? And there's the 1 year and there's a 3 year. And yeah. Maybe did you want to speak to that a little bit? What that
sure,
is,
yeah,
where it comes from?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the formation of the synagogues is really it's its own topic of study within scholarship unto itself. And synagogues within the land of Israel, how they came about, were they around during the temple? They were. There were synagogues during the temple. We know this from the apostolic scriptures, but like the archaeological evidence and whatnot is very interesting. And then the synagogues in the diaspora, like in Rome and other places. But ultimately, what were they doing in the synagogue? Were they doing the same thing that the synagogue does today? Were they saying the same prayers that the synagogue says today? Were they reading the Torah? Well, we know that they were reading the Torah because the apostolic scriptures tell us that they were, right? Yeshua goes and he's called to the Haftarah portion, and the portion that he reads is a portion that we still have in the synagogue today. And so, if you look at the different portions, there's 2 different ways that they separate the Torah. And the idea was, well, we'll read through the Torah in how long? And there was a 5-year. At one point, there was a 5-year, which was not very popular. So you'd read through the Torah in 5 years. And then there was a 3-year, and my father did a lot of work on this. He argues that the 3-year was, in fact, the most popular in the first century, and that Yeshua probably went to synagogue and they read through a 3-year Torah portion. So every 3 years, they were going through the Torah portion. You can still find on TorahResource today, we put out lists of the 1 year and the 3-year portion, so you can go and see how it's broken up. And ultimately, when I was growing up, we adopted the 3-year portion, the 3-year cycle, in the synagogue that I was at. And the reason we did that was not because we thought one was necessarily better than the other, but ultimately it was just because the portions were so much smaller. So we had a lot smaller portion to be able to dive into and really get into. And actually, I preached on a Torah portion a week ago, and it was very large. So, it was 3.5 chapters long, and there's just so much to cover. How long are you going to preach on 3.5 chapters if you only have, if you only have 45 minutes, is very difficult to get to. But ultimately, the 1 year Torah portion, where you read through the Torah in 1 year, became the standard, and it is now the standard within Jewish synagogues around the world. Within the Messianic circles, some have adopted the 3 year just for the reason of trying to get a shorter portion. But ultimately, I have moved to a 1 year portion just so I can be in lockstep with the rest of Messianic Judaism, but also non-believing Judaism. I think it's important to try to connect where we can. I think Paul did that, right? He always went to the synagogue first to try to, talk to the Jews. So I'm trying to stay in a study pattern with non-believing Israel as much as I possibly can. So I read the 1 year. It is a lot, and so we actually split it up. So you read a little bit every single day, and then we'll read maybe a chapter on Shabbat. And with the Torah portions, we have the Haftorah portion, which is a passage from the prophets and the writings. And ultimately, they did this because there were times during persecution where the Torah was not. So the legend goes. There was times in history where the Torah was not allowed to be studied by the Jews, and so instead they would study something from the prophets that reminded them of the Torah portion. And so if you look at the Haftorah portion, oftentimes the themes are the same, or maybe they'll reference something in the Torah portion that is that week, or maybe there will just be a word or a phrase that is used in the Haftorah portion that's also used in the Torah portion. And then, of course, as believers in Yeshua, we all wanted passages from the apostolic scriptures as well. And so the lists can be a little bit different. My father put together an entire list for both the 1 year and the 3 year portions that have apostolic, the New Testament readings that same thing. Maybe it's a theme, maybe it's a word, same words, something like that. And then other Messianic ministries also have lists as well. A lot of them are the same, but there are deviations. So it really comes down to preference and what you're comfortable with.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you. That's fascinating. Okay. Well, I think with that, that's probably a good place for us to land this plane.
Sure.
Perhaps you could guide audience members to your work, or where would you like to direct people if they want to engage with what you're doing at the Torah Resource or the podcast? Or
Yeah. So TorahResource.com is our website, and there is just a ton of not only material that you can purchase, like commentaries and whatnot, but there's also a huge amount of free stuff. We have a blog. We have over 100 free academic articles. We have a ton of free stuff on our YouTube channel. And then we actually have a second YouTube channel where I do a weekly YouTube show called Messiah Matters. I do it every week on Wednesday mornings, and then it's up for people to watch whenever they want on YouTube. I do not during the summer, but during the school year, I do a 1 Corinthians Bible study. And so if you go to Torah Resource, you'll see in the toolbar there's something called TIMS, which stands for the Theological Institute of Messianic Studies. And if you click on that, that will take you to our digital library. It's a paid service, but it is a huge library of Messianic and Christian and study materials, and there's free stuff on there as well. But on Tim's, you can sign up for the 1 Corinthians Bible study. It's totally free. I offer notes and weekly live Zoom classes. And so, go check it out. And like I said, the library membership is $15 a month or $150 a year, but ultimately it gives you access to our entire digital library. And I think it's well worth it.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent. So I'll try to get as much of those links in there as I can in the
It's a lot.
description.
Yeah.
Try to direct them in that way. All right. So thank you very much for your time, and I
Thank you.
appreciate you taking the time to speak to me and sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.